Chapter 4. During the first week of June, the Scotts piled into the family SUV and drove to Destin, Florida. Monica drove first, with Don taking over once they reached the halfway point. He sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window and letting the sun warm the right side of his face, while the air conditioner cooled the left. He grinned as he thought about how great it would be to see his cousins again. The last reunion had been 2 years ago, and had felt all too brief. Don looked at the kids in the back seat. They were fast asleep, their heads together. They had bonded surprisingly fast. Don often found one in the other's room in the mornings. It was as if they had become inseparable. Monica pulled into a rest stop at the halfway mark, and once everyone was refreshed, Don took over. He was always relieved when he saw the familiar hotels that surrounded his Uncle Nate's house because, no matter how many times he'd driven there, he always felt like he was going to get lost. He turned left into a neighborhood filled with towering trees and found the house he was looking for. There were a dozen cars in the driveway and on the lawn. It was midday, and plenty of relatives were milling about the house, among the cars, with beers in his and her hands. Don didn't know where to park, so he made a U-turn at an intersection and parked as close to the house as possible, 2 houses down. He could hear the laughter and music the moment he stepped out of the vehicle. He smiled at Monica the way he always did when he was surrounded by family. The first person to greet Don was not Uncle Nate, nor was it any of his uncles. It was a tall, white-haired old man whose name Don couldn't remember. "Say, young fella," the man called, "spare me some of that money you got hiding there." "I don't have any money," Don replied, putting on a false smile as the man tossed an arm around his shoulders. Every time Don saw him, the man jokingly asked for a handout. It bugged Don to high heaven and made him very uncomfortable. He carefully maneuvered his family past the possibly drunk relative and stepped into the house. He was greeted by the smell of fried fish. There weren't as many people inside as there were out, which was fortunate since the house wasn't very large. Don spotted Uncle Nate in the kitchen directly to the right of the front door. Aunt Mimi was next to Nate, playing with her trademark pearl necklace. "Donovan Scott!" She raced over and hugged him. She then looked down at the boys. "Last time you only had one." She smirked. Don didn't know what to say, and it was too noisy to really get into it. "I'll explain later, Aunt Mimi," he said into her ear. She nodded and waved him into the kitchen. It only took 5 minutes for Don to explain the situation to his immediate family. They seemed to accept what he told them, which wasn't surprising considering he didn't tell them everything. He then thanked his aunts and uncles for dinner and told them he'd see them tomorrow. Their hotel was so ridiculously close that they could have walked there. When they parked in the lot, Monica grabbed Jordan, leaving Don to carry Connor. During the trek to the 3rd floor, he thought he heard the boy whispering, but wasn't sure. Don looked at Jordan in Monica's arms and saw his lips moving slightly as well. Were they talking to each other? Monica opened the door to their room and set Jordan on the closest bed before running to the bathroom. Don slowly laid Connor down next to his son. Both of their lips were moving, and there was a quiet hiss of words coming from the two of them. Don leaned as close as he could to his son, trying to make out what he was saying. Jordan suddenly screamed. Don jumped back in alarm as Jordan sat up, continuing to scream bloody murder. Monica came running out of the bathroom a moment later. "What the hell is happening?" she asked. At that moment, Jordan ceased screaming and just sat there, breathing heavily. He looked down at Connor, who was still asleep beside him, and then to his parents. "What's wrong, son?" Dawn asked him. "I had a bad dream." "About what?" Jordan took a deep breath before saying, "A mean dog." After calming Jordan down, Dawn got his son to go back to sleep. He and Monica settled down on the other bed. Dawn simply stared at the dark ceiling, watching the occasional car headlight flash across it. How could he sleep after what his son told him? The mean dog. It could have meant anything. Jordan hadn't really been raised around many dogs besides Pepper, who was being watched by a kind neighbor, but the boy wasn't afraid of animals. But Dawn knew what dog his son was referring to. How was Jordan dreaming about it? Dawn cast a wary glance at the young boys in the other bed. They appeared fast asleep and no longer whispering to each other. "Go to sleep," Monica mumbled next to him. "Easier said than done," he whispered back. "What happened earlier with Jordan?" "Nightmare." "I saw your face. It was more than a nightmare to you." "What do you mean?" Dawn's heart quickened. "The dog. It means something to you." "No, it doesn't." Why was Dawn resisting? He'd wanted to talk about this before. Why not now? Monica raised an eyebrow. "What aren't you telling me?" "Drop it, please." Instead of responding, Monica rolled onto her other side, facing the window and the kids. Dawn sighed and eventually fell asleep to the soothing sound of the air conditioner. After having breakfast at Uncle Nate's the following morning, everyone headed to the beach. Luckily, only half the family from last night made the excursion that day. The Scotts were a notoriously loud bunch, and 50 of them on the beach would have been chaos. Watching his aunts, uncles, and cousins having fun took Dawn's mind off of Monica's cold attitude toward him. She was still upset with his refusal to talk about his problems last night. He had missed his chance to tell his wife everything and didn't know when the opportunity would come about again. Monica lounged on the folding chair, soaking in the sun and reading a book. Dawn was in the water playing with the boys. Every now and then, he looked at his wife, and she looked back. She was definitely mad. Dawn contemplated telling her his secrets over a few beers. The coward's way. Suddenly, someone else caught his eye. A middle-aged man stood a few feet behind Monica, and Dawn couldn't take his eyes off of him. The man seemed just as interested in Dawn. He was wearing a tropical shirt and tan khakis with big black shades over his eyes. Dawn couldn't tell for certain if he was staring at him with those sunglasses, but he felt like he was being watched. The white-haired man turned and walked toward the boardwalk and away from the beach. Dawn sat at the table of the hotel's cafeteria while Monica and the kids filled their plates at the buffet. Dawn himself was too distracted to eat. He was still thinking about that old man at the beach. He had been staring directly at Dawn, despite all of the other people in the water. Dawn hadn't recognized him, though. Suddenly, a terrible thought came to him. What if he was being followed, investigated? Why would he be investigated? There was the chance, however, that the man on the beach had nothing to do with Dawn. It could simply be his guilty conscience at work. He looked up as his wife returned to the table with the kids. She smiled as she sat down, and Dawn was reminded of how much he adored her. He had to tell her the truth, and soon. On the way back to the room, he ran into his cousins Nina and Candace, who were staying a few rooms down the hall. Nina said her parents offered to watch Jordan and Connor that night if Dawn and Monica wanted to join them for a night in downtown Destin. Dawn quickly jumped at the chance to get Monica drunk so he could talk to her. He did not, however, relish the thought of leaving Connor with his aunt and uncle. The image of Lewis's mangled face briefly flashed in his mind. Don wouldn't be able to live with himself if any harm came to his family. But he had to start trusting his nephew around other people. School would start up again soon. That thought made him break into a cold sweat. After returning to the hotel, Don retrieved the sleeping boys and put them on their bed. Monica had changed into her nightgown and sat on her bed, watching. Don changed into his pajama bottoms and sat next to her. His head was spinning from the drinks, but he felt good. Confident. He was ready to talk. "Honey," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about my brother." "I'm listening." Don checked on the children, who were both fast asleep. Christ, this is so hard. He had been about to tell her, but his chest suddenly hurt. "You love me, right?" She chuckled. "Of course I do, no matter what." "Even if I did something evil?" Monica's mirth quickly vanished. "Donovan Scott, tell me what happened." "I would die if I lost you," he said through gritted teeth. This was not going as well as he'd hoped. At that moment, he suddenly felt like he would lose his wife if he said any more. "Do you really think you can back out now?" Monica asked. "I've known you for a long time, Don. I've loved you nearly as long. Nothing you've done will change the way I feel about you." Don sighed and began his sad tale. "Do you believe in demons?" After a moment, Monica said, "Yes." "Good. Then this story will go down easier, but I promise it's all the truth. It all started when I was 5, the same age the boys are now, and my mom was bitten by a dog. But it wasn't a real dog. It was a demon hiding in a dog's body. It happened right here in Destin, during one of our family reunions. The demon had wandered out of its cave and attacked Mom right in my grandparents' front yard. She was pregnant with my brother at the time. My grandpa told me later that night that there was a legend of a demon hiding in the woods of Destin, that once it bit you, it could whisper in your ear to do bad things. You could choose to ignore it, or you could fall victim to its influence. But it couldn't control you outright. It could only do that if you did the ultimate evil." "The ultimate evil?" Monica asked quietly. "Murder," Don whispered back. "Once you committed murder, the demon could take total control of your body. My childhood was worse than most people's. I grew up watching my mom act strangely. My brother, Ethan, also acted strangely. When he was born, he didn't cry. That wasn't so strange, but everything else afterward was. He tried to walk much earlier than he should have. He learned to spell words with his alphabet blocks before he was 1. He killed bugs for sheer pleasure. He even claimed to remember his own birth." Monica gave a small gasp, but Don kept going. "Mom, on the other hand, went through a lot of stuff behind closed doors. Screaming, crying, nightmares. It all led to my parents' divorce. Well, that and my dad cheated on my mom with a younger woman. Mom confronted that woman once, in the parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly, and I overheard the woman tell Mom that Dad thought she was a demon." "Demon?" Monica said, as if catching on to the theme. "Yes. At that point, I think the demon was whispering in her ear, because during a summer stay with my dad, he told me that girl, Agatha, had died." "Did your mother—" "Yes," Don said. "But I wasn't sure at the time. It was around that time that she'd started dating a man, one she claimed kept her centered. She seemed normal around that time, so I figured having someone to love kept the demon at bay." Ethan, on the other hand, was extremely cunning. For years, he acted like a regular kid. I figured the demon was having trouble controlling them both at the same time, so it focused on Mom for a while. And Mom seemed an easy target. Once, Mom's boyfriend, Adrian, had taken us to a barber shop. While I was getting my hair cut, the barber let slip that Adrian was seeing a woman other than Mom. Ethan overheard this, of course. Then Mom started acting crazy again. So much so that Dad showed up in the middle of the night to steal us away from her. But she found out. She attacked my dad. Ethan escaped the house and ran off. Mom went after him, running on all fours like an animal. I ran after them both and found them in the woods behind a cul-de-sac not too far from my house. Mom was digging a hole in the middle of this small field. In that hole was Adrian's body. I thought at the time that Mom had killed him and that the demon had taken control of her again, but I was wrong. "What do you mean?" Monica asked. "I'll get to that later. After I saw Adrian's body, the demon talked to me through Mom's voice. It said it wanted all of us, Mom, Ethan, and me, as one happy family. It already had Mom, and since she'd been pregnant with Ethan when it bit her, it had him as well, but it couldn't have me. Then, Dad showed up in the field and fought with the monster for a while. He had a gun, and I thought he was going to shoot the Mom thing, but then lightning came out of nowhere and struck it dead. I was blinded at first, but when I regained my sight, Mom was dead and Ethan was gone. Ethan was missing for years, and by the time I saw him again, I was living in Texas with Dad. I was in my mid-20s and working security at a mall when Ethan showed up. I'd met a homeless woman living in the mall, and she told me she'd seen Ethan tailing me every time I did my rounds at night, after the mall had closed and I thought I was completely alone. You can only imagine how much this freaked me out. She also told me that her husband had been taken one night while they slept. They'd stayed in the closed-down movie theater in the mall, along with a lot of other homeless I never saw. The woman's husband was found in a pond just outside the mall's parking lot the day she told me this, and I assumed it had been Ethan who'd killed him. Then, one night, I finally confronted him. He'd killed all the other homeless people in the mall, at least a dozen of them. We fought for a while, resulting in a fire breaking out. He trapped me inside the mall, and I nearly died, but I managed to escape. Ethan didn't like that one bit, though. For some reason, he merely taunted me for a year after our encounter. He left dead animals in my car, he broke into my townhouse and stood by my bed as I half slept, so that I knew he was there but was too terrified to actually look. "I don't understand," Monica suddenly broke in. "How did it control Ethan? I thought you had to murder someone in order for it to control you. Did he kill someone before the mall?" Ethan had murdered someone before the mall. Adrian. Remember when I said I thought it was my mom who'd done it? It was Ethan. But it turns out that when Ethan found me at the mall, he wasn't being controlled by the demon. It had used him to kill a bunch of people that Ethan had called failed experiments. I don't know what he meant by that. He'd escaped its grasp, but being with it for all those years had driven him crazy. He'd killed other people just for the fun of it. Anyway, I hired a private investigator to track Ethan down. He couldn't seem to say any more. Don shook his head and took a breath, and then he said, "I killed my brother." A long silence followed. At first, he didn't know if she had heard, but when he looked at her, he saw the expression on her face. Confused horror. Not only did she hear him, she believed him. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you kill him?" "Self-defense," he said. "When I went to Ethan's house, he tried to attack me. I shot him. Dawn was lying, but didn't know why at first. And then it came to him. He needed to justify his actions. He had killed Ethan because he was afraid of him. There was no other reason. "Where did the gun come from?" Monica asked. It was his, he answered without thinking. He'd forgotten about that little plot hole. The gun had actually been his father's, of course, and he had taken it with him to confront Ethan. Monica said nothing. After I shot him, I discovered he'd been living a normal life with Ivy, and she was pregnant with his child, with Connor. I contemplated shooting them both as well, but I just couldn't do it. So I left the house as quickly as I could and went in search of the source of all this misery. I went to Destin to search for the demon's lair. I found its cave, tried to blow it up, but the demon, in its true horrible form, attacked me. It chased me outside. The moment it stepped foot out of the cave, it was struck by lightning. It was the damnedest thing. Lightning had saved me twice. Monica took a moment to process all of this. It had been a long, fantastical story after all. Finally, she said, "But what does this have to do with our son? I mean, I get Connor, but what about Jordan?" "I think I may be cursed too." "How? Did the demon bite you?" "Yes, that night in the cave. But I'd been showing signs of the curse before that. There was this kid I was friends with named Robbie. He stole my favorite pencil that I let him borrow. I got so mad that I punched him in the throat. Another time, there was a kid who pushed me off a swing set, so I threw a rock at his head and knocked him out, nearly killed him. Before Ethan died, he told me our father, Patrick Scott, wasn't my biological father. I don't know who my real father is, but I think he was cursed as well." "How do you feel about what I just told you?" he asked. "Not great," she replied quickly. Then she looked to the other bed. "Will this affect Connor?" Dawn looked as well. "I've definitely seen signs in him." "I don't know what to say to all this," Monica murmured. "I still love you, and I'm not afraid. You've never hurt me, and I know you never will. But I'm afraid of Connor now. Are we ready to take care of someone with his problems?" "I've thought that myself a few times," Dawn replied. "If there's anyone who can help him, it's me. I've lived with this my whole life." "What did the demon want?" "As far as I could tell, it wanted to use us as avatars so it could walk on land. I guess it needed human beings. Every time it came out in its true form, it got struck by lightning. But it's dead now." Monica nodded and relaxed next to Dawn. She then cuddled closer to him, as if showing she was not afraid. Dawn felt better, but only a little.